Alright, welcome back. So in this video, we'll create a patch endpoint using Spring Boot. So here I'll actually have to correct myself from the past few videos, where I mentioned that we'd be using a put request. And you will see this quite a few times in some APIs, where put is basically used to update a resource. However, what I found is that more correctly, you would use a patch request if you always want to update an existing resource. And put is more correctly used if, for instance, you want to create the resource or the object if it doesn't already exist. So kind of like the post request. But really, if you want to only update existing resources and only update certain fields of it, so making partial updates, a patch request is the better representation for this. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to use a patch request. And so what's going to happen here is if we, let's say, create a bank with this account number, and then we make a patch request that updates the transaction fee and the trust, we want the service to update the data so that if we now retrieve all the banks, you can see here it has been updated with the data that we provided. Now also it depends a bit on how you want to design your REST API. Oftentimes you would use the identifier here as a path variable. So in our case that could be something like this. And then you only provide the data you want to update in your request body. However, here I've decided to actually move it all into the request body so that we have again the same kind of bank object in the request body, and we read our identifier, which is the account number, from the request body. So much for the REST API design and why we're doing what we're doing. So now with this out of the way, let's go into our IDE and start implementing this. So as you can probably imagine, I'm going to start again in our test case. So here I am in the bank controller test. And in here, I'm going to create a new nested test class, just like we did before. And I'm going to use patch/API/banks as the display name. And then the class name should be patch an existing bank. All right, and so in here, I'm going to create my first test case. And I'm going to scroll down here a little. So this should update an existing bank, first of all. That's the happy path. So let's say given the account number 1234, when we now make a request, a put request in this case, to our base URL, and inside this request we're using a body, so I want to do this for now. This actually looks the same as in the post request, so I'm going to look over here and I'm going to take the content type, application JSON, and also the content from up here. And in fact, I will need, of course, also a bank object, not just the account number. So I can also do it similar to how we did it over there. So updated bank should be, well, some bank with an account number that already exists. And then I'm going to update it using this trust and transaction fee. So now I'm going to update the variable name down here, and I'm going to store this as perform put. Or in fact, we're using patch now, so perform patch. And then we say perform patch, maybe let's say perform patch request, and do a print. And I'm going to scroll down again here. And then we expect, first of all, that the status code is okay. So this should be, again, the status code 200, indicating that the operation has been performed. And this is all that we need for now. So again, we're going to go step by step, and we want to get this test case to run first. So now let's go ahead and run our test. And then we should, of course, get our failing test, again, using the test-driven development cycle with red, green, and refactor. So we have our red test, our failing test. So now it's time to make it green. Let's also take a look why it's actually failing. And of course, you're expecting a status code of 200, so okay. And here again, we have the status code 405, which means method not allowed. And we've seen this before, so this means there is no patch method that's allowed on this URL. So it was able to find the API/banks endpoint it does exist, but there is no patch mapping for it. So let's go ahead and create that now. So over here, we'll create a patch mapping. I'm going to call this update bank. And from the request body, again, we get a bank object, and we're also going to return that one for now. And again, let's keep it simple. So we're just going to return the object that we get. And we remember that this is of course not the proper implementation. And then let's go ahead and run this test case again, which should now work. And let's also refine it a little bit. So down here, we not only want to expect that the status is okay. All right, so it's actually still failing. Let's take a look. So we're still getting method not allowed. And that's because I'm actually using a put request here. So it seems like I forgot this again. But of course, mock-MVC allows us to do patch requests just the same way. All right, and now it should run through. So down here, we want to assert that not only the status code is okay, but also we have as the content, we first of all have the content type, which is again application JSON, of course. And then also what we can do, and what I'm going to use to also refine the other test case that we have, is in this content block, we can also assert the entire block of content or JSON data that we get. So inside the content block, I'm going to use JSON. And in here, I can now use the object mapper to compare this to our updated bank object. Of course, it's serialized version, because what this endpoint should return is in fact just the updated bank data that we gave it if it was able to update the bank as it should. So this is actually a nicer way to assert this kind of thing. So up here, for instance, in our post test case, we can do the same thing. So instead of asserting each property of the object by itself, we can also remove this. And then instead in the content block here, assert that we have JSON data and that it's the same as the data that we gave it. So here I think it's called a new bank, and this should work just the same way. So that's also one of the reasons why we like to have fast running tests, so we can run them many times and we still know that they pass. And then let's see up here. Well, here we've really just made a GET request. You could also create a bank object here. So the expected bank that you expect to be returned, and then compare against that. But I think this is fine in this case. And then I think we're done refactoring the existing test cases. So this is really just a nicer way, especially if you have larger objects, to just compare all of their fields. All right, so yeah, as you can see, this still passes because, well, we're just returning the original object that we get. So now one other thing we can actually do quite easily is we can get this object back again. So we want to get our base URL / our updated bank.account number. And then we expect that this will of course give us from our get endpoint that we already have now the same object. So the object mapper write value as string of the updated bank. So this way we now make sure that we did indeed persist the changes that we gave the service, and that it didn't just trick us and just gave us back our original object. And this way we can now properly test that we're actually doing what we should do. And now of course this should fail, because in our current patch endpoint we're not really doing anything. And the same thing we can also do up here. We can again just make a request to our get endpoint, and this way we can quite easily assert that this works as it should. So we should also do this in our test case for the post endpoint. So again, I'm going to say that the content should have the same JSON content after we've called the post endpoint. All right, and with this we can run the tests again. And then of course the patch endpoint will still fail. So in our controller we should now see what we actually want to do. Now I challenge you to do this on your own because it's really the same process that we did before for the post endpoint. Except that now, of course, we want to have a bank in the request body that already exists. So the account number must already exist in this patch mapping, whereas on our post endpoint, we check that the account number does not already exist. So it's really, of course, a different use case, but it's really very similar. So feel free to pause the video here and do this for yourself, and then we'll see how you can do it. All right, so we'll of course create this method in our service, create the member function, which will also return a bank object, and this will simply delegate to the data source. So here I'm going to say also update bank. I think that's a fair name for this function. And I'm going to say return and then refactor this and convert it to an expression body. And then of course we go one layer down. So on this data source, we'll create this member function, and on the interface again, I don't want any implementation here. Instead, I'm gonna go into the mock bank data source, and then in here below the existing implementations, I want to add our update bank. And now this one will first search for the current bank object if there is one. And so we look through the banks collection, and then we find the first, or null, which fulfills that its account number is the given account number. And if there is no such element with this given account number, we say again, no such element exception. And it's really also the same message as up here. And then if there is such a bank which already exists, then we want to say from our banks collection, we just remove the current bank, and instead we add our new bank. So add the new bank. And then we want to also return this one just because we decided that the endpoint should return the bank that it received. All right, so that should do it. If there is already a bank with the given account number, it will remove that and add the new one, which is basically a replace. And if there is no bank that has the account number, we'll get our no such element exception. So with this, we can run our tests again, and now the current patch endpoint test should pass. All right, here we go. We have a green test. Now we can refactor anything we'd like to refactor, but there is really nothing I want to refactor right now, I think, except that here I'm going to say again, it should suppress the not used warning if the method is annotated with the patch mapping. All right, so now it's time again to test also the non-happy path. So I'm going to go down to the patch existing bank, and then we have another test case here. And let me close this down for a second. And then this one should also return a bad request if no bank with given account number exists. So this is the same as for the get endpoint, where if you have an account number, let's say does not exist, then that one should also return a bad request, which usually indicates that there was something wrong with the data that you provided to the service. And in fact, I should again make this a bank object. So some invalid bank where I'm using invalid account number and the rest doesn't really matter. But it has to be the other way around. So first the trust as a double and then the transaction fee. And then again, using our mock MVC, when we make a patch request to our base URL, and as the content this time, we provide this invalid bank. First of all, we have also the application content type. So in here, if we now provide the invalid bank with the invalid account number, then we of course expect, and again, let me split this up. So perform patch request, and then we can say perform patch request and do a print. And then we expect that we get a status code of bad request. And that's really it. We could also say that we expect the content to be empty, but for now this should suffice. So let's see what happens. And in fact, since we have the exception handler in our controller, this might already work, but there seems to be something wrong with it. So let's see. Alright, so down here we have expected bad request, so that's number 400 in the HTTP status codes, but actually we got not found. Okay, so let's see if we can figure out what's going on up here. So could not find bank with the account number, that looks good. If we look into the controller and into our exception handler up here, we have one for no such element exception. And indeed, it goes to the not found. And this makes actually sense. So in the get endpoint, when we want to get data about a bank or an account number that doesn't exist, that should be a 404 not found. And I think actually the same makes sense even for our patch endpoint. So I think this mapping is actually fine, and we should instead fix the test. So instead of assuming we get a bad request, I think not found is even better. And then it will also say could not find a bank with this account number that was provided in the request body. So here it's really, I think, a matter of fixing the test. So sometimes you have to think about, well, first of all, what you're testing, but then also the question is always who tests the test. And really it's of course your decision, or if you have any requirements, then you know what the response status should be. Here I think is not found is even better than just a bad request. Alright, so this is looking good. Let's go ahead and start up our application here. So we're again up on port 9000. So let's switch to Postman. Now over here, if we get all the banks, of course we start out with our 3 banks that are hard-coded in our mock data source. And then if I post a new bank over here, we get of course the same bank as a response, currently with a trust of 80 and a transaction fee of 10. So now let's see if we make a patch request with the request body being the new bank, having the same account number but new data. We expect that we get first of all the same data back. We get a status code of 200. And if we now check what the current status of our banks is, we see we have this new bank, and it also has the updated trust of 85, and the transaction fee has been reduced to 3. Alright, looking good. So now all that's left regarding the REST endpoints that we have planned is the delete endpoint. So that's what we're going to look at in the next video. If you like this one and you learned something from it, please leave a like below, check out the links in the description, and please let us know in the comments what other tutorials or topics you'd like to know about or learn more about. And then I'll see you again in the next video.